Ah, Smart Water, now in a sleek can.
This feels cool, literally.
Perfect for social gatherings and on the go.
Should I start wearing turtlenecks?
One sip at a time, friend. Smart Water cans, for those with a taste for taste. Get yours today.
Welcome to Ballot Battleground Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Margiott, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. It's the final countdown. Less than a week remains in the 83rd session of the Nevada legislature, and it is crunch time. Major policy proposals, big budget questions, and the endgame are all still up in the air. Between now and sine die, that's the fancy Latin phrase for the end of the session, a lot is going to happen. Will education get a funding increase this year? Is there room for state workers to get raises? What about tax credits for movie companies? Will Governor Lombardo's major pieces of legislation make it through? And how many bills will he veto? This week, we have the perfect conversation to get you up to speed on everything NV Ledge as the session winds down with two of the most in-the-know people in the building. If you listened to our reporter roundtable earlier in the session, you know them well. Tabitha Mueller of the Nevada Independent and Paul Boger with Nevada Public Radio. They're as plugged in as anyone, and we got the chance to pick their brains inside the legislative building in Carson City once again. Longtime listeners know them well because they're friends of the pod. Paul Boger, Tabitha Mueller, thank you guys so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
We're recording on Tuesday, so after the 3-day holiday weekend, but the Indy staff, I know you guys were working yesterday. Paul probably was following along as well. So how are we holding up here? 7 days left to go in the 83rd session, guys.
We are looking forward to some sleep. I'm looking forward to sleep.
There was a video game came out when I was in high school called Majora's Mask, where Zelda, has to beat the game in 3 game days, and there was always dawn of the first day, dawn of the second day, and like when I woke up this morning, it was about dawn, and it was dawn of the last week. So I'm ready for it. We're here for it. I'm excited. Little tired, ready for people to go home and not be so cranky, but
Yeah, it's that time of the session where we, cram 110 days of work here into the last 10 days. It's always the best.
It's actually pretty accurate. I think we're just now finally getting amendments to like governor's bills and other changes. So
big movement on bills, and also the introduction of new bills. Big policy in the last week of session. It wouldn't be the Nevada legislature without major policy coming in the final days. So you know what? Let's dig into it a little bit.
We're all along for the ride. You guys are going to be here covering it all every single moment probably. So we do appreciate it. But let's dive in and get some knowledge and insight from our subject matter experts here today about the Nevada budget because, there's a lot of focus on film tax credits and other emergency measures with voting that we're going to talk about. But obviously the most important thing that lawmakers do inside this building is pass the budget for the next 2 years. We don't have to go into all of the reasons why, but projections haven't been all that good. And so generally, I think from a 30,000-foot view, the idea is if things are going to cost money, they're pretty much dead in the water this session. What is that kind of been your guys' experience and what you guys are noticing?
Yes and no. So I think that largely yes. Lawmakers are being more fiscally conservative than we saw them be, say, last session when there was an extra $2 billion plus that could go to education, when the state was flush with COVID relief money, when inflation was adding more money to state coffers than was originally anticipated. So I think that in comparison to last session, you are seeing people be much more cautious, not willing to take as big of swings on legislation. And you've seen them through appropriations that bills that were originally appropriated for $25 million or $10 million are being put down, being brought down maybe 10, 15, 20%. So you're seeing those go to 20 million, maybe then 5 million. Outside of that, though, you also saw lawmakers bring in, $350 million from the rainy day fund. to bolster a lot of those asks for new things. So yes, when you look at the basic budget, it is strapped, but when you look at what was already in savings and what can kind of float the legislature there, you are seeing lawmakers at least be willing to have conversations about spending, whereas I think at the beginning of the session that wasn't there.
I also think that $350 million, though, is probably not something we're going to use, is kind of what the person who introduced that, and that's Assembly Member Danielle Monroe-Marino. She actually runs the Finance Committee on the Assembly side. She kind of said it's there as an emergency measure, and we'll tap into that when we get, if we have to. I don't know if we're actually going to need that, but like Paul said, there's still some money on the table. Now, it's not a lot.
Yeah.
It's a very limited amount. And I think that lawmakers are going to have to decide, what do we prioritize with these extra funding requests? And anything with a fiscal note is facing a death knell, right? And so that's what the lawmakers are processing right now is, what are the bills with the money request? What is the absolute need that we have? We're processing the governor's bills, which also have some large fiscal notes attached to them. Now, some of that was allocated in the state budget. So that's things that they're taking into account. What do we know we had coming in? What do we know that we didn't have coming in? And how are we kind of thinking about it?
I want to talk about what that means for education, because as you noted, Paul, $2 billion increase in K through 12 spending last session, and it's going to be significantly less this session. So are we getting an increase in K-12 spending? I understand there is, but it's small in comparison, at least.
Right. Yeah. We are not. So it is more than was previously allocated in the current biennium, right? So there is going to be more money going towards education. I think in the SB 500, which is the education bill, I think that allocates what is essentially about additional $2 per student per year of the biennium. So it's not a huge increase. You're absolutely right. And outside of that, we're not seeing any increase to charter school teacher pay within that bill. That has been held outside of it. Now, that increase in K-12 public education, that does include those teacher pay raises from last session that were passed outside of the budget. So those are now permanent. But what happens with charter school pay is really going to affect the end game here, because we have the governor very openly saying he's going to veto any sort of legislation, any sort of budget that doesn't include teacher pay raises for charter schools. So that's not in the budget. That's outside of the budget currently. We're waiting to see that bill move. We're waiting to see action. So it's really going to come down to whether or not the governor signs that education budget and hopes to get a charter school bill or not.
I think the one thing that we did see is, and on the deadline, right, we had a lot of bills that were passing rapid fire as they're trying to get through and make sure that we can get all the legislation out that needs to. We saw that the Assembly passed the education budget, and they also passed Assembly Speaker Steve Yeager's proposal, which contains that charter school teacher raise funding. Now, what's interesting to me, and Paul touched on this with the endgame negotiations, Senator Nicole Cannizzaro also has a proposal to do so in her education bill. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see which proposal kind of moves forward, who takes credit, how all that works, and where the governor's office kind of stands on all of that legislation.
And according to the state constitution, it's the education budget that has to be passed out first before the other budget bills. Where are those in the process? We don't have to go super in depth, but are we close to passing those out, or is that going to be towards the very end here, towards sine die?
So what's interesting is that we've actually seen all but one of the budget bills pass. So the governor has 4 of the 5 bills. What hasn't passed is the capital improvements bill. Now, people who know about what happened last legislative session know that we had a special session the day after sine die specifically to pass a capital improvements bill. Now, there was...
And fun fact, actually, that was the shortest special session that we've ever had.
It was an incredibly
Just the
short
one day, right?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it was like the number of hours that it
Yeah.
was. It was just, because that bill requires a 2/3 vote because it has to deal with some taxes, right, and fees. And so that's the holdup. They need to get 2/3 in both chambers because Democrats don't have a supermajority. And they need to make sure that Republicans are on board. And I bet, and sorry, Paul, I'm stealing your thunder here.
No, you're fine.
But when we think about this budget, the negotiations have to all be agreed to, and then the Republicans will join Democrats to pass that bill is sort of the presumption.
I was going to say, are these bills that are essentially just waiting, hanging in the balance, so to speak, for a deal to be struck, essentially?
I think it's not just specifically bills, but amendments to bills, right? So we know that there's a lot of things in play right now. You have the governor's crime bill, which had a massive fiscal note attached to it that I don't think lawmakers were too happy to see. And so we'll probably see that one being amended. We're hearing kind of circulating rumors about it right now. You also have the healthcare bill, right? There's a lot of healthcare measures already making their way through. So granted, I'm not in the rooms where this is happening, but what we're probably expecting is that there's negotiations between the governor's office, between Senator Canizaro's office, and Assembly Speaker Steve Yeager's office. And we've actually seen the governor in the building. We've seen his chief of staff in here. His staff are all over the building as well. So we know that those conversations are going on and happening. It would be nice sometimes to have them out in the public, though, I will say.
This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
What does this all mean, too, for the film tax credits bills? There's these two kind of slightly different proposals, depending on how long you calculate this out. I mean, that's potentially $100 million of money, of revenue that the state's not going to be bringing in the middle of this budget crunch. Is there appetite for these or not? Where are we at?
I think we are still assessing.
Yeah.
We're still assessing what the appetite looks like. We saw news recently of sort of an independent analysis that was done by the Governor's Office of Economic Development. We haven't seen that type of an analysis before. However, the analysis is based on bills before they were kind of amended. And so there's some new proposals that have come up. The proponents of these bills are doing their best to convince lawmakers, you need to bring them forward. Here is how this is beneficial, right? Proponents say this is going to help diversify our economy and make Southern Nevada less tourism dependent. But opponents have said, look, historically, film tax credits have not been good for economies. We're talking about, based on that independent analysis, we're getting back maybe 50 cents to the dollar on the good end, 23 cents on the dollar for the other end when you're looking at that state tax revenue, right? And so for every dollar we put in, we're getting back 52 cents or 23 cents. Now, what folks will say on the proponent side is it's not just about that tax revenue. It's also about the economic force and the drivers and people coming to Nevada. And there's indirect and direct benefits of the economy that are happening from the studio development. And lawmakers are going to have to kind of weigh all of that and make a decision about what they think is best for the state.
Yeah, you guys, Tabitha at the Nevada Independent, broke that story. Basically, this report is not public yet, but showing that the benefit to the state would be far less than what proponents are saying. And so we'll all be watching very closely to see if those bills, again, two slightly different proposals, end up moving here in the final week. The big one that just happened over the weekend as it pertains to elections, which is, of course, a big topic on this show, allowing nonpartisans to vote in primary elections. So Assembly Speaker Steve Yeager dropping that kind of emergency bill here over the weekend. Paul, what did you make of that? He told me prior to the session, or I think post-election, that he wasn't going to bring a nonpartisan primary bill, and now here we are.
I am a little surprised to see it, to be completely honest. This has been a non-starter for party officials, for higher-ups in the Democrat and the Republican Party for years now. We saw a pretty concerted takedown of question 3 just last election. So it is interesting to see a bill come up like this not only just during the session, but especially in the last week. Haven't dug into AB 597 quite as much yet because it came out yesterday, but we are supposed to get a hearing on that bill this week. So we'll see if it moves, and if it does, it's going to have to move quickly. But I do think more than even trying to get the bill passed. I think the speaker is at least trying to have a conversation or start a conversation, maybe for next session, ahead of next session, about open primaries and what lawmakers can do, especially Democrats, to maybe stop the bleeding in Nevada, to maybe get more people excited, especially nonpartisans who can't participate in primaries, to get them more excited about going out and voting and choosing candidates. So I think it's an interesting conversation that's going to start. We'll see if the bill actually gets any legs within this last week, because there's just so much to do.
Yeah, and it's a massive policy proposal, huge change to our elections. Tabitha, do you have any insight onto like what took this so long? I mean, this could have been a bill from day one that came out with hundreds of other bills.
So we actually asked about this, and he sort of said it's just important and we're doing it now. So I don't have any backing for this, but I wonder if this is part of negotiations with the governor's office. I mean, think about it. Would the governor, Joe Lombardo, who has benefited historically from sort of this moderate Republican sort of stance, benefit from nonpartisans being able to vote in Republican primaries? I mean, you see a lot of Republican primaries and Democratic primaries too, they'll skew to the more extreme candidate. And so by allowing NPs to participate in those primaries, I think that may be part of this political calculus. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting is when we're talking about this measure, how will it play out when it comes to the actual election season, right? Will it fuel election denialism? Will people be upset about it? It's because it's not technically open primaries, although Paul said, maybe it opens the door for that. But will it confuse people? How will this work? I think the devil's in the details on that.
Yeah, and is that one similar to question 3 where it would have to be passed twice because it changes the Constitution, or this does not?
It does not change the Constitution because it's not requiring an open primary. It's just allowing nonpartisan voters to vote in a partisan election is my understanding of the measure. And granted, like Paul said, we got this yesterday, so I'll put a little caveat on that one.
Fair enough. Okay. I want to circle back a little bit to something that was a big focus last session, which was getting state workers pay raises. And I forget the exact percentage, but it was several percentage point raises for state workers in the last biennium. Should have talked about this when we were talking about the budget, but I wanted to ask you guys, what's the latest? I mean, is there any chance for state workers to get raises this session, or is that completely off the table?
I think at this point, that's pretty off the table. You're right. We saw a lot of concentration on making sure that state employee pay was more in line with what we see on the municipal level, whether it's Clark County or Washoe County. In that vein, though, the state got to about 13.5%, I think is what it was at the beginning of the session, unemployment in state offices, which seems to be a number they're okay with. They don't think that there really needs to be additional things to help state workers or additional pay increases. That said, I do think lawmakers are looking at PERS, they're looking at state benefits, ways to not just save money, but to increase benefits or at least increase ways that state employees can use their benefits. But outside of that, no, there's not really a lot for state employees for NSHE. And a lot of that comes down to, again, that budget situation.
And we looked at the state worker pay kind of budget, and it's not extreme. Like last year we saw kind of historic pay increases. Mm-hmm. This year we're not seeing that level. I think it's kind of batten down the hatches in the financial storm.
Walk me through, we don't have to go through all of Governor Lombardo's bills. We've mentioned a couple of them here and there. Tabitha, in your experience, the governor gets these 5 major policy bills. Do they tend to usually all get passed? Granted, heavily amended versions of these bills, or is this something where we are waiting on the last final days to see if they get through, or this is just part of the negotiations where they're going to add in some things, remove some things, and ultimately get them to his desk?
I think that what we've often seen with these types of measures, especially when you have a Democrat control, or a majority party controlled House in one, and then a governor who's not part of that majority party in the other, is that those bills get heavily amended, they get shifted, it becomes part of the final negotiations between the majority leaders and then the governor's office, and they're kind of sitting there and saying, what can we keep, what are we what do we feel is acceptable? I think what's interesting this time, though, is with the governor's bills, he really tried to bring forward bipartisan proposals, right? We saw his housing bill, for example, had a lot of support from Democrats. I mean, even on the first day after his State of the State address, Democrats said there's a lot that he said we agree with. Healthcare, for example. There's a lot of measures that are already making their way through the legislature. And I think that is different from last time when he brought a bill to expand voter ID, right? Which was a line in the sand for Democrats that they said we can't do anything with this.
I think, last session, look at the governor's crime bill. He had a crime bill that was much more extreme than what we're seeing in this one, even though, as Tabitha mentioned, his current crime bill does have a pretty hefty fiscal note from the Department of Corrections. That bill did eventually pass, and we saw it pass within the last, I think, hour or two of the session last year or in 2023, and that was heavily amended. So, yeah, we're going to see movement on some of the governor's bills, probably criminal justice, probably housing.
Healthcare.
I think healthcare, economic development. The big one's probably going to be education. There is just a lot in there that I think is repeated in other bills, whether it's the Senate Majority Leader's bills or the Speaker's. There's also a couple poison pills in there that I think are great for their governor's base and conservative Republicans, but are just not going to fly with groups like the teachers' unions. And that's notably, sending state money to state-approved private schools. That has been a non-starter for Democrats since 2015 when ESAs were passed. It's continuing to be a non-starter. So I think that's something that's going to be absolutely out of that bill. Now, when we come back to that charter school pay where things like that happen, that might be put in the governor's bill. That might be something that can be given to the governor as a, hey, we'll do this, so you give us, why.
ESA is a real deep cut for the legislative nerds from the late 2010s.
Yeah.
Tabitha.
Well, the other piece of this, when you think about these bills, is you also have to think about who gets credit, right? Can the governor say after the session that he passed his priorities? I don't think he could last session, right? So his bills were so heavily amended that the policies looked completely different from what he said his priorities. Will his priorities pass this time? Even if it passes in other bills, I would say probably yes, right? He talked about prior authorizations, which is the approval process for insurance, trying to make that less cumbersome. There's some other changes specifically in the healthcare realm that Democrats have kind of put forward. I think some of this has to also come down to who gets credit,
right,
who gets to wave the flag afterward. And you don't think that often matters in the policy realm, but we have people who are going to be running for reelection or other offices. The governor's going to be running for reelection next year. And that is something that is guiding these conversations and guiding the thought process behind some of these negotiations.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
And certainly vetoes will be a part of the political landscape in 2026. I think we've mentioned it several times on the show already, but, Governor Lombardo vetoed 75 bills. It was a record last session in 2023. Does it seem like it's shaping up to where Democrats are going to send him bills to where that record could be potentially challenged, or is there a different tack where, as part of these negotiations, they're not having to force his hand with quite as many bills that they would be expecting a veto on?
I think we're going to see a lot of vetoes. And the reason that I say that is when you watch what's happening on the floor with floor votes, to me, any vote that gets a Republican opposition, a strong contingent of Republican opponents, that is a sign that could potentially be vetoed by the governor. It's interesting because he vetoed the first and only bill that he's vetoed so far has been Assembly Speaker Steve Yeager's mail ballot box bill, which would expand mail ballot or boxes to drop off ballots at, and that bill had one Republican in support on the Assembly side, right? And so just because you get some Republican support may not be a sign that your bill is going to make it past his veto pen.
I think that just in general, we're not seeing the sort of partisan bickering between legislative leaders and the governor's office that we saw in the last month or so, last 6 weeks of the last session. As Tabitha mentioned, there's been a lot more communication, it seems like. There's been a lot more cooperation between the governor's office and legislative leaders. So I think that is a good sign that we're probably not going to see a new record set, but I don't think we're getting out of here without at least a few dozen, maybe even several dozen vetoes. And we're at that stage now where we are starting to see those more controversial bills come up for votes, and they're absolutely seeing those split party votes that really dominated much of last session again. So I think that in the coming days, we're going to start seeing a rash of vetoes, and that can really start changing the conversation about what happens in the very final days. Because if the governor does get veto happy, lawmakers may just start sending him whatever they want because they know it's going to get vetoed anyway. So
yeah, I think at last check there was 50 or so bills in the governor's office waiting for a signature. I believe he has 5 days to sign those. So as we're recording this on Tuesday, he will probably have signed and vetoed a couple of bills by the time you listen to this. How does this session wrap up? What does the end game look like?
That's the $1 million question, Ben.
I know we don't know that here on Tuesday.
If I had a crystal
I bet it
ball.
ends at midnight on June 2nd. That's about as much money as I'm going to put on it.
I'm going to sound like a broken record here. And granted, we're still kind of trying to get a lay of the land of what, everything is kind of going to be. We've seen, some healthcare bills are under discussion. We've seen the crime bill. We've seen, I think, again, any of the governor's bills are going to be part of that end game discussion. Outside of that, I think there's some measures that Culinary Union wants, that gaming is maybe backing Culinary Union on. We've seen measures that, special interest groups are kind of pushing for, and then there's also people pushing for vetoes on them. And so all of those conversations are happening right now, even behind the scenes. And so I think that the main visible ones you're seeing is probably education. Probably the amendments that we're seeing to, say, Governor Joe Lombardo's crime bill, which are expected to come soonish, right? They have to. We're in the final days.
I think that we're going to get a budget. I think that the CIP bill will eventually make it to the governor's desk. Outside of that, I'm going to put no predictions down. Like I said, June 2nd, midnight. Yeah. That is when it ends. And see y'all in 2 years. Yeah, and we know a heck of a lot can change in the matter of 5 or 6 days. I think if we were to have this conversation next Tuesday, it would sound entirely different. So that's why it's important to follow Tabitha in the Indy, follow Paul, follow News 4. We're going to be reporting on the legislative session very intimately over the next week or so. Tabitha and Paul, keep the faith, okay, in the final days here. You guys do incredible work. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
A special thanks to Tabitha and Paul for making time in their busy schedules to join us this week. If you made it to the end of this episode, I really appreciate it. If you have guest ideas, episode ideas, questions, comments, compliments, concerns, anything at all, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you. My email is bjmargiott, MARGIOTT, at sbgtv.com, and put Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. And if you have a minute, I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and a review. That helps the podcast show up higher in searches so more people can discover the show. Thanks for listening.